Frozen pain was the first thing she understood, not the cold itself, but the way it hollowed her bones, until even memory felt sharp. Her body dragged across the snow by hands that had already taken everything else. Her name, her strength, her dignity, leaving her beaten and stripped, not for desire but for cruelty. Dumped like a broken thing at the edge of a forest where the wind howled as if it were laughing at her, her skin burning and numb at the same time, her breath coming out in ragged white ghosts that vanished too quickly. And when the men rode away without looking back, the silence was worse than their laughter, because it meant no one was coming. No one cared, and she would die there unless she moved. And moving felt impossible until instinct rose, louder than despair. A raw animal refusal to lie down and let the snow take her, so she crawled, fingers cracking, nails bleeding, dragging herself inch by inch toward the dark line of trees where the wind might be weaker, every movement tearing pain through bruises that bloomed purple and black across her body, her mind slipping in and out of memory, her mother's voice, the smell of summer bread, the sound of laughter from a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. And each time she thought she couldn't go on, the image of dying alone in the snow forced her forward, because even a worse fate felt better than disappearing without a witness. Hours passed, or minutes. Time lost meaning as the storm thickened, snowflakes stinging her eyes until she could barely see. And then through the blur she saw it, a shape that didn't belong to the forest. Straight lines where there should be chaos. Smoke threading weakly into the sky like a promise she didn't trust. A cabin old and scarred by winters, standing stubbornly against the storm, and hope terrified her more than despair, because hope could break her if it was false. But she crawled anyway, driven by the last spark of life, dragging herself across frozen ground until her hands struck wood, the porch rough under her palms, splinters biting into flesh she could barely feel. And with the last of her strength, she lifted one hand and knocked, the sound weak, almost swallowed by the wind. And when nothing happened, she knocked again, her forehead resting against the door, breath shallow, darkness pressing in from the edges of her vision. And just as she began to slip away, the door opened. He stood there frozen in shock, a tall, broad man with a weathered face carved by years of hard living, his eyes widening not with hunger or judgment, but disbelief, as if the storm itself had delivered him a ghost. And for a heartbeat, neither of them moved, the wind screaming between them, snow blowing into the cabin. And then she collapsed forward, her body giving up at the threshold, and instinct took over for him, strong arms catching her before she hit the floor, the shock of her icy skin jolting him as if he'd touched death itself. And he slammed the door shut, with his foot shutting out the storm, the sudden quiet deafening, and laid her gently on the floor near the fire, his movements careful, almost reverent, as if afraid she might shatter. He had lived alone for years, far from towns and men, and yet nothing in all that solitude had prepared him for this, for the sight of a woman broken by violence, her body marked by cruelty, her breathing shallow and uneven. And without hesitation, he stripped off his own coat and wrapped it around her, turning away to respect what others had already violated, stoking the fire higher, melting snow for water, working with the steady calm of a man who had learned to survive and help himself because no one else would. And when her eyes fluttered open, unfocused and frightened, she flinched, her body recoiling as if expecting another blow. And the look on her face struck him harder than any fist ever had. "It's over," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady, not demanding belief, just offering truth. And though she didn't understand the words at first, something in his tone anchored her, and she let herself drift again, not into darkness but into warmth, real warmth, the kind she'd forgotten existed, waking later to the crackle of fire, the smell of broth, and the strange safety of 4 solid walls. And panic surged when she realized she was inside, with a man, alone, but he wasn't watching her like a predator. He was seated across the room, giving her space, eyes focused on the pot, his presence firm but distant, like a guard rather than a captor. Days passed in fragments as her body fought to survive, fevered dreams mixing with waking moments, And every time she woke, she expected the kindness to end, expected the price to be demanded. But instead, there was food, clean water, bandages, and silence when she needed it. Questions only when she was strong enough to answer, and slowly, painfully, she began to understand that this man was different, not because he was gentle in words, but because he was disciplined in restraint, because he treated her not as something he'd found but as someone entrusted to his care. And that realization terrified her almost as much as it healed her, because it meant trusting again, and trust had nearly killed her once already. Outside, winter tightened its grip, storms sealing them into the cabin, and inside something fragile began to grow. Not romance, not yet, but dignity. The slow return of it as he brought her clothes that fit. Not cast-offs, but things he'd clearly made an effort to find. As he built her strength with food and patience. As he spoke to her like an equal, even when she barely spoke back. And when she finally told him what had happened, her voice shaking but steady, he listened without interruption, without rage that demanded action. And when she finished, he simply nodded and said, "You didn't deserve any of it." And for the first time since the snow closed over her body, she cried, not from pain but from release. By the time the storms eased, she could walk again, slowly, and the cabin no longer felt like a refuge borrowed from a stranger, but a place where she mattered, where she was safe, not because she was hidden, but because she was respected. And she didn't yet know that this was only the beginning, that the man who had saved her life would soon make a choice that changed both of them, forever. A choice not just to shelter her from winter, but to raise her above the suffering she'd endured, to let her live not as a survivor scraping by, but as a queen of her own restored life. And as the fire crackled and the wind finally softened outside, the story of how she crawled to his cabin ended. And the story of who she would become was just beginning. And if this chapter gripped you, if you felt her pain, her fight, and the quiet power of compassion in a brutal world, subscribe to the channel, because stories like this don't just entertain, they remind us what humanity looks like when everything else is frozen.